The murder of Declan Gavin was the spark that ignited a bloody feud. Gavin had been the leader of a drug-dealing gang in the Crumlin Drimnagh area who were rivals to another local group headed by Brian Rattigan. Once the best of friends, the two gangs were now sworn enemies after Gavin was accused of being a rat in the wake of a Garda drugs bust.
I don't fucking believe him at the scene outside that kebab. Who? That fucking rat Deco Gavin.
Deco fucking
yes,
Gavin?
Yeah.
Wait, hold on a sec. Lads, we're going. Fucking hell, he's fucking dead!
Declan Gavin was stabbed by Rattigan in full public view on a summer's night in 2001.
Fucking rat!
It wouldn't take long before his murder would be avenged. The murder of Declan Gavin, here at the Crumlin shopping centre, had left a power vacuum within his own gang. Considered to be the brightest member of either of the two feuding factions, he was the chief organiser and a highly respected figure.
Despite his young age, Declan Gavin was considered a very smart and cunning criminal. He was almost a born gang boss. He forged criminal contacts with criminals based in Europe as well as all around Dublin.
He was capable of being ruthless when he needed to, but he wasn't a hothead the same way Brian Rattigan was. So upon his death, there were several other young men who were anxious and willing to take over.
The man who took the reins was one Frederick Thompson. Fat Freddie, to those who knew him, he was a tough and ruthless figure who was prepared to do anything to get back at the Rattigan gang. Although not from the Crumlin area, he was the unanimous choice to succeed Declan Gavin.
Freddie was born in 1980. His people were street traders. Lived all his life up to his teen years in Maryland. He was a drug pusher, petty drug pusher in the early days. But they saw that money was so easily to be made from the drugs that it spiraled and got bigger and bigger.
Thompson had learning difficulties as a child, and he was prone to violent and slightly paranoid behaviour when he was on cocaine. And he was able to learn from other older criminals who he had associations with, some through relations, and so he knew how to run a drugs business from quite a young age.
And he had been marked out kind of in his teenage years as one to watch by the guards. So he started associating with Declan Gavin, and he absolutely worshipped him. I mean, he would have done anything for him.
And he took it very much to heart when Declan Gavin was killed and the manner in which he was killed.
He, more than anyone else, wanted to seek revenge for what had happened to his friend, Declan Gavin. And he soon emerged as the strongest personality who was willing to take the gang to the next level.
Meanwhile, rival gang boss Brian Rattigan was determined to go on the offensive and finish the Gavin group for good. Despite all evidence pointing to him being Gavin's murderer, Rattigan thought keeping a low profile was the wrong thing to do. Instead, he believed one more hit and his rival gang would crumble.
After the Declan Gavin murder, there was a huge increase in intimidation, assaults, shooting attempts, and the fear was that it would only be a matter of time before someone was murdered.
Again, it's a lot to do with turf war. Who controls the situation, as well as the image? Who controls the area? Who sells what?
Death threats began to be issued. Thompson particularly was anxious to make his presence felt as the new leader.
Then you see the drive-by shootings happen, and then everybody gets shot. Not only the person they're after, but a lot of people around them get shot as well. This shouldn't be happening, because they are young adults of people that live in our community as well.
Brian Rattigan and his men smelled victory and were continuing to attack the now Freddie Thompson-led gang. On St. Patrick's Night 2002, Rattigan learned that several of Thompson's men were drinking in a Judge Darley's pub near Houston Station. Rattigan fired several shots at the pub at around 1 a.m, but it would only be the start of a night of high drama.
It's not clear whether he actually intended on killing anyone that night or whether he was just giving a warning, you know, I'm armed and dangerous. But later that night he went home to the house, he went to bed. He was apparently very drunk himself and had taken quite a lot of drugs. He went to sleep. He was in bed with his girlfriend Natasha, and his brother Joey was downstairs watching television.
He spotted two men coming up the driveway in balaclavas. He immediately jumped up. He ran into his brother who was sleeping.
Brian! Pasha! Get up quick! Pasha! Cells outside, bodies and guns. What?
Joey tried his best to wake up his brother and his girlfriend. Natasha did wake up and he told her there was two men on the way into the house. They seemed to have guns and balaclavas.
Joey hid in the back garden when Natasha ran into the bathroom.
The gunman shot Rattigan directly there was close, absolutely couldn't get closer, shot him in the back. As they were running out, Natasha was screaming and she opened the door of the bathroom and one of them pulled the balaclava half off his face. It was real, you know, he wanted her to know who he was.
Natasha ran back into the bedroom to find her boyfriend covered in blood. He was rushed to hospital, but it didn't look good. A bullet at such close length usually meant death.
His situation was very serious for several months, but he did eventually make a full recovery.
And he had to wear a colostomy bag after it, but it was a really botched hit for the Thompson gang because they couldn't have had him in a better position, lying face down in a bed.
There was certainly a lot of surprise that they didn't finish off the job, that he wasn't murdered. The subsequent developments in the feud might never have reached the level, and we might not have seen so many murders if Brian Rattigan had that night lost his life.
A Garda investigation was quickly launched into the early morning shooting. Brian Rattigan refused to cooperate with the Gardaí, but as his girlfriend Natasha had confronted the two men involved, she would have had a good look at the gunmen. She was questioned by detectives and eventually named who she knew was the shooter.
It's believed that Brian's long-term girlfriend Natasha McEnroe gave a statement identifying Thompson, but he was never charged in relation to this because it was deemed that there was not enough evidence.
There's no shortage of information coming in, but putting tangible evidence on that information is the most difficult part. There's no point in going to the DPP with information that he did this and that and the other thing.
With Freddie Thompson not facing any charges over the Rattigan shooting, and Brian Rattigan out of the picture recovering after his near miss, Fat Freddie and his gang were able to establish themselves as top dogs in Dublin 12. But nearly a year on, the Thompson gang had still not forgotten the murder of their former leader, Declan Gavin. They wanted blood and would soon strike back, right at the heart of the Rattigan gang. Brian Rattigan had been badly injured after he was shot at his family home, here on Cooley Road. As leader of one of the two feuding factions, and the man who had murdered rival gang boss Declan Gavin, there was a price on his head. So after escaping with his life, he laid low for a while, moving between a number of safe houses across the city. But the re-energised Thompson gang was hungry for a scalp. They felt it was the only way they could get revenge for the murder of Declan Gavin. The opportunity to do so would arise in July 2002.
It was early enough in the feud and it would have been difficult to ascertain exactly who was with who. Joey Rattigan was only 19 at the time and he got a phone call from who he considered to be a friend of his, Paul Warren.
Hello? All right, Joe. Are you coming down to the pub?
Asked him to meet him in the Pimlico Tavern for a drink.
Next night, man. Staying with the bird night. Come on, man. Just a few points. Yeah, right. Just give us about half an hour, right?
It was just an average night out, as well as Warren, there was 3 other of his friends there. Later in the evening, Joey's girlfriend also joined them for a couple of drinks.
Just on leave.
No. It's my day off. I'm not going home.
So fuck it, there's no bleeding buzz in this clipping anyways. At this point, yeah.
Joey Rattigan's trusting nature would prove to be his undoing, though, as it would ultimately cost him his life.
First of all, they dropped Joey's girlfriend home, and then really in an elaborate ploy, they brought Joey in the van to another man's house on the pretext of continuing the night out. But what was really happening at that point was arrangements were being put in place for a gunman to be positioned at Joey Rattigan's home. So after spending about an hour at this other house, Joey was offered a lift home again in the van, and he was dropped outside his family home.
See you later, lads.
A man is in a critical condition in hospital in Dublin after being shot in the head. The man was attacked on the Cooley Road in Drimnagh. He was found by a neighbour who alerted the emergency services.
He was very severely injured and brought straight to hospital. He survived for a short time in a life support system, but his family ended up having to make the decision to turn off the life support system.
Only a year before, Joey Rattigan had been celebrating his 18th birthday. But he was now dead, the second victim of the spiralling feud. An eye for an eye, a brother for a brother.
That was the first murder involving a gun, but there had been other shootings, and I began to hear from guards that there was serious trouble going on. It wasn't seen as a full-blown feud. And even the guards viewed it because of their youth, their relative youth. Definitely didn't seem at the start that this was going to turn into the saga, the 10 years of violence that it was. But it was unusual up to that time for someone that young to be shot by someone that young in the city. There just weren't that number of guns around, you know.
That level of violence then, naturally enough, percolates right across not just the victim is dead, but the family of the victim and the extended family of the victim. So every tit-for-tat killing, for example, has a ripple effect out, you know. Blood is thicker than water and families gel together. It's a vicious circle.
Joey had only been a minor figure in his big brother's drug empire, but as a blood relation, he was a prized scalp. Upon hearing the news, Brian Rattigan was said to be apoplectic with rage.
He wasn't a senior gang member. Who knows, he might have become one in his older years, but at the time he was murdered, he wasn't. It was considered to be direct retaliation for the fact that Brian had murdered Declan Gavin in 2001.
Absolutely nothing to do with it, and they were getting tainted just by virtue of their surname, and that's regrettable as well. And where they have nothing to do with their brothers, sisters, or cousins, or whatever, and by virtue of attacks on their family members who are innocent in all of this, and they're getting dragged into a feud.
They believe the shooting may be part of a Gangland drugs feud in South Dublin. The scene has been sealed off for forensic examination.
Initially, it's shock that someone has been shot. Sometimes the feeling is, well, thank God it's not my child. And that's what goes through a lot of community people's heads. And then other people are saying, well, those scumbags deserve it. And that's when you start feeling, oh God, if people are saying things like that someone deserves to be shot, how are we ever going to deal with the crime levels in this city?
Although he may have been naive and the opposite of his career criminal brother, Joey Rattigan was singled out for who he was, not what he did. The two warring factions had now suffered a casualty on each side. Both had scores to settle.
It was now a spiral that had gotten out of hand completely. So it's a vicious circle, and it was ever increasing.
The three men who had been drinking with Joey Rattigan were all taken in for questioning by Garda. It would soon emerge that Paul Warren had a key role to play in Rattigan Jr.'s murder.
We knew it was related to the whole feud. Again, it was very hard to investigate because we had no cooperation from anybody.
including Brian Rattigan.
At one stage, one of the men told Gardaí that Paul Warren had been responsible for the shooting. Some senior detectives would doubt that Warren, who wasn't a senior gang member in the Thompson gang whatsoever, and he was really just being used by them, some of them doubt that he would have the killer instinct to actually murder somebody, but he was certainly involved in arranging Joey's murder that night.
There wasn't enough to go to the DPP with anyway. It was some of them, of course, didn't answer any questions.
Brian Rattigan took the murder of his younger brother very badly. He doted on Joey, and in the months after his murder, his drug use increased. He even got a huge tattoo of Joey on his chest. His spiral out of control only got him into more trouble with the law.
In the months after Joey's murder, Brian Rattigan really went completely off the rails. He was using a huge amount of drugs himself. He was becoming completely paranoid.
He knew, of course, that his brother was only murdered to get at him, and this affected his psyche hugely.
Just a month after Joey's murder, Garda received a tip-off that Rattigan was holding a stash of heroin at the family home. They arrived with a search warrant, and to make things easier for the officers, the front door was lying open.
His home had been regularly raided by Gardaí, and Gardaí were able to enter his house and discover this large consignment of heroin, which he basically had in a sock in his bedroom.
I must say that the Gardaí in Sundrive were very brave in dealing with him. They were fearless in the way they went about their work. There's no doubt about it, he was the most dangerous. Having said that, the detective unit in Sundrive had a very good intelligence on him and knew an awful lot about him.
Brian Rattigan was caught red-handed at his home on the Cooley Road and was due his day in court for the heroin possession. Gardaí were hopeful that the central figure in the feud would soon be behind bars and that the bloodshed might stop. But even when locked up, the gang bosses were still able to control matters on the outside.
He was operating a drugs cartel from his island in Portlaoise.
As the Rattigan gang strike back with another public execution.
Don't fucking move!
That was a total assassination.
The murder of Joey Rattigan was sweet revenge for Fat Freddie's gang. As younger brother of rival gang boss Brian Rattigan, his assassination was as close as the Thompson gang could get to seeking maximum retaliation for the slaying of their fallen friend, Declan Gavin. It was a massive blow to Brian Rattigan, who lost total control in the months following Joey's murder. While on bail for a heroin bust at his home, he was still continuing his criminal ways and had obviously something against the authorities, because he thought nothing of taking them on.
In 2003, down near Lansdowne Valley, himself and Wayne Zambra and another were going to do a job.
Rattigan was in the backseat of a stolen car, alongside gang members Wayne McNally and driver Wayne Zambra. Gardaí were on the lookout for the stolen vehicle, though, and spotted it near the Bluebell Road in Inchicore.
Are you following us?
Yeah. When Gardaí tried to approach them, the driver sped off. They were pursued by Gardaí.
He had a pump-action shotgun, and I don't know where he was. We don't know from intelligence. We don't know where was he going that night.
Fuck you! What are you doing? Fuck's sake!
Rattigan opened fire.
Fuck off!
And the detectives returned fire.
Luckily, none of the members of the Gardaí inside the car were injured. The men abandoned the car and ran to try and get away from the Gardaí.
They gave him chase, and he actually cocked a gun at the guards. Whether he was considering actually pulling the trigger or not, is anyone's guess, but as soon as they pulled the guns on him, he dropped it immediately. But it was an absolutely stupid thing to have done.
Rattigan was arrested just after a short pursuit, and he was charged with that, and he's been in prison since.
Rattigan was sentenced to a further 4.5 years for the Bluebell Road shooting, which added to the 6-year sentence he had received for the heroin possession. This meant he would be off the streets for a lengthy stretch.
It's still very unusual for criminals to shoot at Garda, but in the case of Brian Rattigan, in many ways he was considered one of the most violent psychopathic figures that has ever been seen in the history of Irish underworld. Unlike the likes of the General Martin Cahill or the Viper Martin Foley, well-known criminals that came before him, Rattigan was a heavy drug user, and this obviously influenced his behaviour.
In fact, it was Martin Cahill commenting on the advent of the new breed of criminals. He did say that we look like choir boys compared to what's coming after us.
The younger guys, the Rattigans, the Thompsons, were all users themselves, and it does give them a feeling that they can do absolutely anything they want. I mean, how stupid is it to pull a gun on a guard? How stupid is that? How stupid is it to kill somebody in front of 15 witnesses?
Rattigan's a thug. I mean, a real ugly, nasty, ugly in personality terms. A very nasty piece of work. But again, it was the drugs and the amount of money that turned him into the really dangerous person that he was.
The 12-year sentence handed to Brian Rattigan for possession of heroin and shooting at 2 detectives was a massive boost to Garda, who now thought there would be a lull in hostilities. The man who had ignited the bloody feud 2 years earlier would now be behind bars for the best part of a decade. Garda would strike another blow against the feuding gangs later that same year.
Freddie Thompson was having his own problems with the law. He also rammed a Garda car in 2002, and as a result of this, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for this incident. This was a major success for the Gardaí to have the 2 main players in this feud behind bars. They knew it would result in a period of calm among everybody.
The latter half of 2003 may have passed without any major incident, but the following year would be a different story. Threats and warning shots were a frequent occurrence in the early part of 2004. But it was a night at the end of February which would escalate hostilities and start the bloodiest part of the feud.
It was all to do with drugs and a turf war. Who was going to supply and who was going to get the best patch. And after the murder of Declan Gavin, you then had the next murder that occurred was Joseph Rattigan. And Paul Warren was fingered by Brian Rattigan, the brother of Joseph, because he was the last person with Joseph Rattigan before he was killed.
Since Joey Rattigan's murder over 18 months ago, Paul Warren had tried to remove himself from the gang war that he had become involved in. He had started a new job and was living outside of the conflict zone in Clondalkin. But fate would eventually catch up with him.
Paul Warren was a glazier by occupation, and he had attended to some glazing work that day. He went to Gray's Public House at about 3 o'clock in the day, had a few games of pool.
Right, mate, there you go. What's crack, bud? How you getting on? Not too bad.
When he was there, a guy called Jonathan Mooney came into the pub. Mooney had been in jail with Rattigan and had some association with him. Mooney got his girlfriend's mobile phone and he made a call. And he said that he'd seen Warren in the pub.
Ah, yeah, man, not too bad, not too bad. Here, listen, I'm up with the pub with the bird, and you'll never guess this here. Yeah, man, Paul Warren's up here. Yeah, right. Right, go back to us, right? All right, go on, talk to you, man. Right, look, boy. Hello.
About 10 o'clock, a phone call came to Jonathan Mooney, whom we didn't know at the time had any hand actor part in this. And he was asked what was Warner wearing and where was he sitting. Shortly afterwards, Gary Bryan and John Roach appeared at Grace Public House.
Nobody fucking... Don't fucking now!
Fired a shot at him and missed. And he was shot on the way to the toilet. Gary Bryan then pushed in the door and shot him again.
Don't fucking move!
Right, I got him. Let's get out of here.
And he died there where he lay in the toilet.
Gary Bryan would have been a very low-level member of the Rattigan gang. He was more a hired gunman. He also had a serious drug problem, which had caused huge problems for him in his own personal life. And it had made him, basically because of his drug addiction, he was willing to go to any lengths to earn money to feed his habit.
Even though the witnesses at the pub were unable to provide any concrete information, Garda were handed a first break within days when an informant told him that the shooter was Gary Bryan. His apartment was immediately placed under surveillance.
Information came to hand that a guy with the nickname Tipper had shot Paul Warren. The name Tipper was the nickname of Gary Bryan. We found that he was staying in Ashley Hall up in Dublin 8 and that his girlfriend was Valerie White and she was living with him. Valerie White was arrested and she was released after 48 hours. 2 days or 3 days after she was released from custody, she appeared again of her own free will on Kevin Street.
Thanks very much for coming down to make this statement.
What Valerie White was about to tell the Gardaí would blow the whole case wide open.
And I live in Bunting Road in Walkinstown.
Okay, Valerie, in your own time, if you could tell us what you know.
Come down here to Kevin Street to tell you the truth about the murder of Paul Warren. Things were really quiet up until the night Paul Warren was shot. Gary wasn't even going up to them that much. Both stayed in. And about 8:30 that night, Gary went out.
Hello? Or yeah, what's the story?
He was gone about half an hour, and then he came back on his own.
How long did he stay for?
It was about 5 or 10 minutes. And then he went into the bedroom, and then he was gone again. I was going mad because he'd only just come in the door and he was gone again. The next time he came back, I didn't know, but there was another fellow with him.
Yeah, we took care of that. Listen, it was a piece of piss, no problems whatsoever. It was handy.
When I walked in, I saw Gary. He was standing by the bed, and there was another fellow with him. He was tall and he had short brown hair. I know now that his name is John Roach from Drimnagh. He told me to call a fella about some coke to see if he had it. They both took the coke. And I was talking to Gary. I said, so which one of you did it? So I knew it was them. Where were you tonight?
Down the pub.
What are you doing down the pub?
Myself and Roach, you just went for a drink.
Forced you wouldn't say it. You're right. Just stared at each other. Then he asked me, would I think anything different of him if it was him?
Listen, a bit of business had to be taken care of, right?
What kind of business?
Warren is sorted, right? He sorted out. Roach, he wanted to do it, and I stepped in, I done it, okay?
Fuck's sake. Gary didn't tell me any more than that.
All this then was backed up by evidence from the phones. Mooney made a statement outlining everything about receiving the phone call, telling the person whom he knew where Paul Warren was sitting and how he was dressed and who was near him. The DPP gave us directions to charge Gary Bryan.
The case against Gary Bryan was very strong, with both forensic and witness evidence against him. Jonathan Mooney was sentenced to 5 years for his part in the murders, but the trial of Gary Bryan would end in farcical scenes.
Valerie took the witness box. She had been given immunity. She took the witness box and she was asked, did she make a statement to the Garda? She said she did. And she was asked what should she tell the Garda, and she said, I can't remember.
I'm sorry. I know I can't stand over that statement anymore. What I say is true.
So a case collapsed.
It was a cruel blow to the Gardaí, who had come so close to taking a killer off the streets.
Just didn't work out because Valerie White didn't give the evidence that was required. Probably, we would think that it was because of fear. And I suppose it's hard to blame her. Like, self-preservation is a big thing.
Paul Warren's murder escalated the conflict between the warring gangs. It would soon go out of control.
Unfortunately, each killing does elicit a response.
They were all ready for action.
Some guards said, for every murder, there's been 10 or 20 attempted murders.
Brian Rattigan's revenge had been swift and vicious. With Paul Warren now dead, the feud between the Thompson and Rattigan gangs had developed into a full-blown tit-for-tat war. And now innocent family members of the feuding criminals were being targeted. This conflict was escalating at a dangerous pace.
The families really wouldn't have a say in it. I mean, if it's you and your mum or dad spoke to you about the carry-on you're having and that, and you just don't want to listen to them, well, that's it. You actually wouldn't probably care what happened to your mother and father or our house.
Most family members don't know that the young person's involved in criminal activities because as far as they're concerned, they're coming home at a reasonable hour, they're with their mates. They don't know what to do when the rest of the community, or when they're reading the newspapers and they're seeing all these things about their son, you know, in the newspapers that he was this, that or the other. When you held your child in the maternity hospital, you didn't say, I want you to be a murderer, I want you to be a robber or a drug dealer. What you thought was, when you held your son or your daughter, is, I'm going to do the best for you for the rest of your life.
The extent to which the feud had now involved the immediate family and not just the gang members themselves was shown by an incident in September 2004.
Richie, who was Brian's elder brother, a contract was put out on his head. This was really, again, done to antagonise Brian.
The families, particularly, I wouldn't say wants it. They wouldn't want it. Who would want that at your door? Going up to bed to go to sleep, not knowing what you'll wake up in the morning. Has that been a grenade or a petrol bomb or bullets through your window? Who'd want that? Nobody would want that.
We did have to set up family support, a few different sections of family support at one stage, because the children of one group of parents were probably against the other group of parents.
Thompson's gang was one man down with the loss of Paul Warren. Rattigan's mob was aware that Thompson would be wanting payback and was on high alert. For the whole of the year following Warren's murder, the Thompson gang failed in its attempt to strike back. But only a week after the anniversary of Warren's death, this would all change.
John Roach and his brother Noel would have been very close to Brian Rattigan. They would have grown up with each other in Drimnagh. In John Roach's case, it's suspected that it was himself and Gary Bryan that carried out the murder of Paul Warren. John Roach moved away from his base in Drimnagh, not too far, albeit he was staying in Kilmainham, but he did feel safe there. Yeah, it was very common because the areas around Crumlin, Drimnagh and the south inner city and even the north inner city, there were hotspots. The gangs knew the family locations of the rival gangsters, so people felt compelled to move for safety reasons.
John Roach's error in believing he was safe in the apartment in Kilmainham would prove to be a fatal mistake. The Thompson gang was stalking their prey and was ready to pounce.
Like many of his associates, he wasn't moving around as frequently as he should have. Some of Thompson's associates discovered where he was living, and it only took a couple of days' surveillance for them to have a hitman ready.
He was returning from a journey, and he parked his car on Irwin Street, and he was ambushed and assassinated as he went towards his apartment.
Just after midnight, it's believed a black BMW type car pulled up just here near Murray's pub in Kilmainham. Gunfire was heard, and a man in his 20s was found collapsed on the footpath outside.
During that investigation, the Garda at Kilmainham and Kevin Street, we discovered that an apartment in an apartment block was leased, and was leased by people belonging to Freddie Thompson's gang. And this apartment overlooked the flat that John Roach was living in.
An ambulance brought the victim from where he was found just behind me to St James's Hospital. Just a few hours later, at 3:30 a.m, he was pronounced dead. The dead man was known to Garda and is believed to be the victim of a Gangland feud, one of many in a series of tit-for-tat killings between two rival groups.
The body count of the feud was starting to pile up. With 2 members of each gang now 6 feet under, the government was under huge pressure to react. Justice Minister Michael McDowell was tasked with controlling a new type of organised crime that was becoming an epidemic, not just in Dublin, but in many parts of the country.
A few months before Roach was murdered, then Justice Minister Michael McDowell described gangland murders as the last sting of a dying wasp.
Many of them have been arrested, many of them have fled the country. And I don't believe that there's new energy in it at all. I believe that this is, to some extent, the sting of the dying wasp.
This obviously came back to haunt him in a major way, as in the following 3 years, gangland murders would spiral out of all control, not just in Dublin, but in Limerick also.
It's all taking place in working class areas where senior politicians really have no interest. You know, I remember a former senior Garda used the expression "thieves killing thieves," and if that's your outlook, then you're basically saying let it go ahead.
It's so sad. It really is. Some come the nicest of parents, but we weren't born into the world that way. They just took the wrong road. But in fairness to a lot of them, there was no other road for them. There was no other road for them. With so many deaths. You won't see a TD or a Taoiseach or any minister or a young drug user's dead. No matter how he died, if he was shot or overdosed, you don't see them at them. You see the local community there. You know, and that's the sad part of it. They don't mean anything to anyone. They're just another one out of the way.
McDowell knew that he had to do something to curb the rising gun culture in Dublin. He announced a special Garda operation, codenamed Anvil, which would give extra support to Garda in fighting the gangs.
A task force had been set up by the Garda to tackle a similar type of feud in Limerick, but there had been less fatalities in that feud than there had been at that stage in the Drimnagh feud. And what I was looking for is that the Garda needed the resources, whether it was surveillance resource, whether it was extra manpower or armed units, that they needed that to try and give the community some type of respite, but also specifically to target the gang leaders and the weaponry that they had.
The Garda presence was needed and needed badly at the time. I must say it's quite impressive when you do see the Garda response, when you do see the roadblocks, and you do see elderly-looking gentlemen carrying guns who are obviously special forces.
Anvil was met with relief by the Garda units that were policing the feud on a day-to-day basis. The Garda Commissioner was given an extra 15,000 hours of overtime each week to target the gangs in Crumlin and elsewhere in Dublin. It meant they could get up close and personal with the criminals.
Operation Anvil is clearly having an effect and did address the issues which were arising in the first quarter of this year.
I have no doubt in my mind that we saved a lot of lives with Operation Anvil. It was one of the best things ever. The lads were so dedicated. It was just in your face. Every time we had checkpoints, every time they'd be seen, they'd be stopped and checked. Now, they called it harassment. We called it the prevention of crime.
It was up to ourselves to utilise it in whatever way we wanted to, and we had to utilise it on the Gangland feud between Rattigan and Thompson. In indoors checkpoints, there was cars abandoned coming up to checkpoints, and we found, as I said, guns in some of them.
The Garda measures were successful in halting potential attacks between the two feuding gangs in the month following John Roach's murder. But the two gangs have become so powerful across the city and ruthless in terms of protecting their own turf that the first victim outside the two gangs themselves was inevitable.
Garda investigate Dublin's latest sinister gangland killing. The victim, 27-year-old Terry Dunleavy, a notorious criminal.
Terry Dunleavy was a criminal from North Inner City, quite a feared, a dangerous young man. But again, like many of the people we're talking about, actually comes from a very good family. Terry had been sourcing, it's believed, his drugs from the Thompson gang, and he was brutally murdered at a flats complex in Ballybock over an unpaid debt, which again shows how expendable life is to many of those involved in gangland crime.
Originally from Marino, he was well known to Garda and served time for firearm offences and for a series of armed robberies, including one when he threatened a Garda with a sawn-off shotgun.
Dunleavy's murder was a message that the gangs were not to be messed with. A debt of just €26,000 was the price of a life, and the gang warfare was now spreading outside the Crumlin and Drimnagh boundaries. But Garda efforts to police the feud were making inroads. And indeed, by July 2005, with the Dublin 12 community sick of the violence and mayhem, efforts were made to broker a truce.
A lot of people were saying I had to stop, but I think even one of the parish priests in the area wants to get the gangs together to see what could happen. Could we have a breakthrough? Could we actually start, living in peace in the community?
We tried mediations at that time with them through Detective Inspector Sutton, who had some training in that field, and the priest, as I said, from Morden Road. But it didn't stop it. It stopped for a while, but they were back to themselves again after a few months.
The uneasy truce would soon be smashed, though, as the feud would reach its darkest hour.
What did Edward do to deserve this death? What did he do? To be tortured and left with no eyes in his head. I don't understand that.